is a fourth panel of the Symposium, Interdependency as a Condition, which we organized as a part of the fourth Arctic Art Forum, organized together with our colleagues from Arctic Art Institute, which locates in Arkhangelsk. It's an Arctic region, high north of Russia. And the fourth panel title is Towards Nonviolent Existence. We have two speakers today, Terike Haapoja and Julian Reid. And sorry, and you go. I can't hear you.
No, my sound is off. I'm just saying that we also have a discussant, Egor Rogalev.
Yeah, we have also a curator and artist, Egor Rogalev from St. Petersburg, and he's going to participate in the discussion after the panel. Okay, hold on, I lost you guys. We decided to conclude the panel with the symposium with the panel towards nonviolent existence, because within that panel we try to look at different processes of so-called slow violence that are happening within different social and political structures. And within this panel, we also will try to look at several cases of violent existence, and maybe come up together with speakers with some propositions towards non-violent. And also, like or focus on during this symposium is the questions why the lives and well-being of some humans and non-humans are valuable above others, and what basis, on what basis is such a gradation done, and who exactly is accountable for this. And in the situation of global pandemic, which unveiled social inequality worldwide, or made it more obvious, this issue is important to address again within thoughts and practice of the curatorial, artistic, and academic domains. Our first speaker is Terike Haapoja, is a visual artist originally from Finland, but based in New York for the last few years. And in her practice, through different artistic formats like installations, publications, writing, video work, Terike investigates the mechanism of othering with a specific focus on issues arise from the anthropocentric worldview of European traditions. So in her research, Terike looked at such definition like trans species, and she looks at the different, she reads different legal documents to pinpoint interrelations or unequal relations of human towards unhuman, or human towards human. Terike presented Finland at the Venice Biennial, 55th Venice Biennial, with a solo show in the Nordic Pavilion. I've seen that work. It was amazing project. And Terike also works together with a writer, Laura Gustafsson. They work as a collective, Gustafsson Haapoja, and they realized several writing and also visual projects together. Terike is an adjunct professor at the Parsons Fine Arts University and NYU in New York. And the title of Terike's presentation sounds like vulnerability, community, animality, and the art of being here with others. And I think the central question of Terike's presentation will be, who is we of political community? Terike, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Anna, and thank you for inviting me. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And yeah, my talk is about 20 3 minutes, and I'm going to read from paper, and then I'm going to have a video in the background, or like actually in the front. So feel free to just listen, and I can also distribute the whole paper afterwards if someone's interested. So maybe I'll just start, and then we can talk afterwards. And so I'm going to just show the artwork in the background, not so much talk about the artwork, but talk about the ideas and thoughts behind the work. And if you want to go more into detail to the artworks and the processes, I'm happy to discuss that then later. Okay, and you can see the image now. Yes. Yeah. The second law of thermodynamics describes the increase of entropy in the universe. This process is irreversible, and so entropy also acts as an arrow of time. Perhaps then loss is how we experience entropy. But even though I start my talk from loss, it's good to also remember that what precedes the grief of losing something is attachment, the love and care and attention that's the basis of coexistence and communality. The figure of the animal entered my work indirectly. This early one-channel video installation wasn't a conscious exploration into questions regarding animality or ecology, but rather an attempt to grasp something that deeply concerned my own lived life. This encounter with entropy, this grief, forcefully pushed me to use any means I had available for trying to understand the ethics of living and dying together, and later, how our institutions and social organizations and systems of knowledge structure our living and dying together. What's important to note is that the image of the animal here is not a metaphor for human passing. Rather, the euthanized horse is someone with whom I share a fundamental relationship with the world. We both are bodies, we both are selves, and because of these things, we both are vulnerable. The 25-minute video is edited from 9 hours of recording of what's best described as a kind of wake. What's left out of the picture, however, is the site of this wake, the grim, noisy facility where slaughterhouse leftovers and carcasses of domestic animals are brought and ground into protein powder that's then fed back to farm animals. Thus, the animal doesn't enter my thinking as a radical alterity, though it does also pose a question about otherness. What's radical in the question of the animal, for me, is the way in which it forces us to think about vulnerability and ways in which beings are made into things and things into beings, and how what is projected onto animality is entangled with the ways in which some deaths are made grievable, while the deaths of some sustain the lives of others. A later version of the piece shows 5 different animals with unedited durations and a soundscape of low, continuous exhale. The name of the work, Community, is an attempt to include the people witnessing the cooling down of the animal figures as part of the landscape of the work. It also points to the fact that the death of non-human animals is the foundation of modern cultures, something we're painfully aware of in times of sixth mass extinction and climate collapse. Thinking of interspecies communality and developing methods for non-human political and legal representation is then the most urgent task. How then to think of interspecies communality in the framework of Western societies? Donna Haraway famously coined the term nature cultures to capture the hybridity and interconnectedness of human and more than human life. But the core institutions of our society don't recognize such hybridity. In fact, political community, as imagined in Western political theory, is built on rising above the state of nature, while this state of nature is imagined as a violent war zone of everybody against everybody. And as such, it also implicitly suggests that nature, or the pre-social condition, is by default predatory and acommunal. It's exactly the exclusion of the non-human realm that is the foundation of political community in Western imaginary. The Party of Others is a project I launched in 2011 in the wake of the parliamentary elections at the time in Finland. The political climate was suddenly saturated with the xenophobic and othering language that followed the rise of white nationalist populism, while at the same time movements for expanding the realm of the political to include more than humans and other excluded groups were gaining traction in the political landscape. For the project, I interviewed people who represented the interests of the more than human world in their various practices and asked, what would a community without exclusion look like? What could be the system of governance of such interspecies political community? The exhibition that presents video and sound material from the interviews explores the way in which language functions as a threshold for political participation in Western thought. Only certain kind of is resonant in many political campaigns for inclusion, but the challenge that including non-humans focus is more profound, as they are never able to take part in based on the ideas presented in the interview that would represent radical, deep ecological views. Rather than having a realistic chance to enter the parliamentary system, the project attempted to move the window of discourse, the Overton window, closer, one might say, to the forest. As we know, modern law divides the world into two categories, those of persons, which is humans and human-made constructs, and things, which is nearly everything else, including the more than human world. Thus, animal rights movements and movements for rights of nature attempt to develop legal tools for making the interests of more than human beings and entities even visible to law. While initiatives for rights of nature often emerge from places with strong indigenous presence and start from the notion of decolonization of the whole anthropocentric state apparatus and its hierarchies, animal rights theory, in contrast, tends to work through a notion of inclusion of individuals to the existing framework. An interesting recent example of the latter approach is the work by Sue Donaldson and Wilkim Lichka, who in their book Zoopolis propose expanding citizenship theory to non-human animals. Their proposal starts from accepting the interdependence of human and non-human lives and developing frameworks of rights that, like the different frameworks that regulate human-to-human interaction, are relationship-specific. In this view, non-human animals, just like humans, can be considered citizens, denizens, or having their own sovereign territories that need to be respected. Donaldson and Kim Lichka draw from disability studies that take into account the fact that many of us are not capable of entering the logosphere of politics, yet do have interests. Concepts such as dependent agency or assisted agency that can include also nonverbal communication make room for political belonging that's not reserved only for those who can voice their concerns. The underlying issue, however, is that the state and its notion of citizenship and subjecthood is already not only anthropocentric and exclusive, but that the way the figure of the human at the center of Western political theory is constructed is already entangled with animalization. Museum of Non-Humanity, a project in a series of work made together with my collaborator Laura Gustafsson, is a touring memorial museum that presents a history of the construction of the categories human and non-human in Western thought. The exhibit of the museum consists of an archive that presents evidence of the way in which humanity has been rhetorically distinguished from non-humanity through the course of history. The viewer can meditate the violent history this conceptual separation has made possible in the melancholy space of the 11-screen, 70-minute exhibition, while the museum's programming is future-looking and brings together practitioners from social justice, environmental and animal rights struggles. Museum of Non-Humanity focuses specifically on one aspect of the non-human, namely the figure of the animal, as the binary opposite of that of the human. In order to see how the figure of the animal operates within racial capitalism, I found it helpful to parse out 3 different conceptualizations of animality so that we are better able to work in their intersection. First, there tends to be a divide between animal rights discourses and social justice discourses. This conflict can be traced back to their ways of conceptualizing the human-animal divide as a species divide. The term speciesism, made popular by Peter Singer, is commonly used in animal rights rhetorics. Singer argues that species-based discrimination operates like any other form of discrimination, such as racism or sexism, where an arbitrary signifier is made to mark the inferiority of a group. Singer leans on the moral theory of Kant that defines the worth of human beings based on their ability for self-reflection and autonomy. Singer argues that if we take this as a starting point, in fact, many animals are autonomous and should be considered moral subjects, whereas, and this is a highly problematic claim that slips from speciesism to ableism, the moral worth of many humans who do not possess these qualities should be reconsidered. On the opposite side of this species barrier, social justice struggles see the problem not so much in the human-animal divide itself, than in the fact that it leaks, in other words, that some humans are being treated like animals. What follows is an unavoidable conflict where one group's rights challenge the other group's protection. Posthumanist discourse complicates this picture by noting that the figure of the human and the non-human are not in fact species constructs, but instead moral and juridical categories. Cora Diamond, for example, points out that moral categories are not created by observing differences, but by performative naming. Simply naming someone an animal constructs them as killable, while naming someone a human socially constructs them as protected. As Matthew Calarco notes, the question of the animal is in fact 2 questions. One concerns the conceptual human-animal binary, and the other are concrete relationships to other species. This line of thought takes as its starting point that since humans are in fact animals, they have had to humanize themselves by rejecting their own animality. Giorgio Agamben famously calls this process the anthropological machine, a lethal process in the core of Western thought that tries to ceaselessly and forever unsuccessfully stabilize the distinction between humanity and its underlying animal body. Because the ideal of humanity is always already biased by culture and power relations, this caesura in the figure of the human makes it possible to strip anyone at any given time of their humanity and reduce them to the non-human foundation. For Agamben, this operation at the heart of Western thought creates the conditions of possibility for genocides and extermination camps. In this view, racism, sexism, homo-transphobia are instances of animalization. All the historic divisions generated by the anthropological machine require the concept of animal as their reference. But the animality at play here has little, if anything, to do with the multitudes of non-human species and individuals. Rather, it's a theoretical abstraction that is already constructed through projecting onto it everything that is rejected from the ideal of man. And so posthumanist thought in its various forms argues that also other species and nature can be seen as being dehumanized through a logic that relies on this anthropocentric hierarchy. The last approach, and in my mind the most productive one, is developed by thinkers who come to the question of the animal from a decolonial perspective. The philosopher Sil Ko argues that in order to understand human-animal relations and the logic of animalization in contemporary moment, it is necessary to include the optics of race. Ko states that even though animal abuse, as well as discrimination of humans, has of course always existed, the emergence of race in the wake of the colonization of Americas radically transformed also human-animal relations. What Ko argues is that with the invention of race as hierarchies within the figure of human, the animal as the binary opposite of human proper was accompanied by a new figure, that of the subhuman. In other words, the racialized human other. This new figure was placed in the cosmic order somewhere between humans and animals. And so while racialization happens through animalization, that's based on the assumed proximity of the so-called subhuman with the literal non-human animals in this great chain of being, also animals are racialized through their proximity to the so-called subhuman. So the subhuman and the animal become two faces of the binary opposite of the white supremacist human proper in Western imaginary. Che Gosset writes with regards to the tendency of animal rights movements to treat the struggle for rights as a linear progression. Quote, "It is as though animal is the new black, even though blackness has already been racialized through animalization." End quote. Manesha Dekha notes similarly how resorting to equal human rights is not possible if the ideal of the human has already been constructed by excluding from it racialized others. Sil Ko builds a powerful argument for what she calls Black veganism as a form of resistance to all forms of animalization that are based on colonial white supremacist notion of humanity. In the light of this, it's clear that it's not possible to fight racial capitalism without fighting the logic of animalization. Humanity and animality are not species categories. Some animals are indeed white and privileged, while a widening majority of world's populations of all species is being reduced to a disposable mass that sustains the accumulation of wealth of few. Capitalism needs non-human, subhuman, and inhuman resources. Their surplus is literally extracted from somebody's body. To think of the question of the animal through the optics of animalization allows for thinking of constructive forms of resistance in the intersection of race and animality. Despite his investment in the logic of animalization, Agamben is not really interested in the fate of non-human animals. But perhaps the case is not that the facilities of animal agriculture are camps alongside other camps. Perhaps it's animality itself that is the site on which a camp, any camp, can be built on. And because it is a foundation, it itself remains invisible, even when it reaches massive proportions. Carol Adams points to the fact that the animals we consume are most often female animals. Thus, the sites of animal agriculture are sites of gendered violence and coerced reproduction. It's the female animal, both human and more than human, that literally sustains capitalism with her labor. Perhaps then this is one of the reasons animal agriculture is still not fully politicized. Now, this sounds like I'm going to make a dreaded comparison, but please bear with me. Hannah Arendt wrote about Adolf Eichmann that he was first and foremost a functionary. He didn't necessarily like what he did, he even felt bad about it, but he was committed to his role of being part of the apparatus. But Arendt also writes that she observed there being a certain pleasure in his being a functionary. And perhaps this pleasure function is overlooked when forms of oppression are observed only through a lens of utilitarian interest. In his study on sadomasochism, Deleuze notes how sadism and masochism are in fact incompatible. While a masochist obviously wants a sadist doesn't want a real masochist, because where's the fun if they enjoy it? But from a psychoanalytic perspective, what drives both desires is a need to break free from the grip of superego. For sadists, this means a state of lawlessness, a kind of Desadean institution without law, whereas for the masochist, this means a childlike letting go of all responsibility. What emerges is a desire for a particular psychological state of freedom, experienced as gratifying freedom from morality and responsibility. Perhaps forms of oppression are entangled with this desire, where the realm of non-humanity or animality functions as a way to create lacunas where, to use Agamben's words, anything becomes possible, but not only for the sake of material gains, but for this sense of freedom itself. In conversation with Marcia Gessen, Judith Butler says of Trump, and I quote, "He is a sovereign, unchecked by the rule of law he represents, and many think that is the most free and courageous kind of liberation. But it is liberation from all social obligation, a self-aggrandizing sovereignty of the individual." End quote. How to then redirect this desire and how to pay more attention to the way in which we conceptualize freedom? Che Gosset writes with reference to Black liberation and what they call animal necropolitics that, quote, "As a process of becoming with, abolition is the unfinished project of ending anti-Black racism, racial capitalism, anti-trans, anti-queer, patriarchal policing, colonialism, animal killing, and caging," end quote. Abolitionism, in this wide sense, ties together racialization as animalization and caging as a vehicle for making race, making animal, and making killable. By working through the concept of abolition, Gosset points towards freedom as the ultimate goal of intersectional ecology. The notion of freedom presented here is not, however, the solipsistic, autonomous individual described in Western thought, but rather freedom to form relationships, freedom to bond, freedom to build communities. In her recent work on radical nonviolence, Butler points out how our self-realization happens through relations. And so when we violate another, we also violate those relations and thus also part of ourselves. The assumed autonomy, ability, and individuality of even a normative-bodied human is at best a temporal condition. We're much better characterized by dependency, interdependency, and being differently abled in different times of our lives. We need care and to be cared for. Our existence is radically interdependent. Following Butler, when we cage beings, be it human or more than human beings, we cut them off from this most fundamental form of self-realization. We literally amputate their being. The world of climate justice, then, has to be a world without cages. Thank you.
Thank you, Terike. A very moving presentation, and I'm fascinated with how you connected, the banality of evil, which is so profoundly embedded into our language, and that also dictates our behavior to such a large extent. I like it how you finished almost with a manifesto. In that way, it's sort of linked also, I think, with the talk of Madina Tostano, that also had to me a very inspirational strain of how we can move towards this nonviolence and care and interdependence and mutual care. Thank you very much. And I'd like to jump to our next speaker, and I think there will be a lot of connection between what Terike is saying and what Julian will be talking about. So Julian Reid is a political theorist, philosopher, and professor of international relations, and he's known for his advance of the theory of biopolitics. His contributions to post-colonial and post-structural thought, critique of liberalism, and seminal deconstruction of resilience. And he's been publishing a lot of books on these topics, including Biopolitics of the War on Terror, and The Liberal Way of War, Killing to Make Life Live, co-authored with Michael Dillon, and also Resilient Life, The Art of Living Dangerously, co-authored with Brad Evans. And today he will be talking, I think, about the new book that is called Becoming Indigenous, Governing Imaginaries in the Anthropocene, co-authored with David Chandler. And this book has been feeding his research about the problem of colonialism today and biopolitics in the Arctics. And he will also talk about appropriation of indigenous knowledge and how it kind of resources global dispositives for neoliberal subjectivity. So Julian, please, the floor is yours, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very kind invitation and introduction. It's great to be here, and I enjoyed the previous presentation from Terike very much. I've learned a lot already over the last couple of days about Arctic research and Arctic arts as well. It's been really useful for me. Yeah, so I'll talk a bit about the research I've been doing, which has gone into this book, Becoming Indigenous, written with my colleague in the UK, David Chandler. This is a book which is a product of a Finnish Academy research-funded project which has been running since 2016 and which is coming to an end now. The project itself was called Indigeneity in Waiting. And it's really an inquiry into the post-colonial conditions of indigenous peoples in the Arctic, but also elsewhere and everywhere internationally or globally. You know, when we look at international relations over the last 70 to 80 years, it's incredible the shift in perspectives on the condition of indigenous peoples. You know, colonial states which previously had dismissed indigenous peoples, had treated them as inferior, had colonized them and exploited them, have gradually recognized the errors of their ways and attempted at the very least to correct that history through promoting the rights of indigenous peoples and giving them legal enfranchisements, talking about the importance, not just the validity, but the even the superiority, the tremendous value of indigenous knowledge and indigenous cultures. So on the surface of things in international relations, it would seem that there has been a dramatic shift from the colonial to the post-colonial periods. The old racism, which underpinned the colonial exploitation, even attempts at the extermination, and indeed successful attempts at the extermination of some indigenous peoples, that old racism has by and large been displaced by a new way of apprehending indigenous peoples, an attempt at least to rebuild and to reconcile the relations between colonial states and colonial societies with indigenous peoples. In this project and in this book, which came out at the end of last year, we're taking a very cynical view of this apparent shift from the colonial to the post-colonial, and coming at it from a more or less Foucauldian perspective in terms of thinking about the ways in which systems of representation, practices of representation and empowerment are never simply benign exercises for political power, but integral, in fact, to the exercise of governance. That there is, in other words, a kind of biopolitics of indigeneity, which is functioning through enfranchisement and promotion of the right to life of indigenous people, which might be compared with the story which, of course, Michel Foucault tells about the biopolitics of sexuality in the earlier modern era, the ways in which modern power, and especially liberal power, has learned to function through the promotion of the right to and the capacity for various forms of sexual freedom and identity. So that's in a nutshell, that's kind of the argument that we're making about the post-colonialism of indigeneity in the project. Indigeneity, we think, is useful to specifically neoliberal colonialism. There's neoliberal regimes, not just neoliberal states, but the vast range of different neoliberal international institutions and organizations have an interest in promoting a certain image, a certain concept of indigeneity, and also framing indigenous peoples in certain ways, promoting a certain image of what it is to be indigenous, to the extent that indigeneity is in fact no longer conceived as simply a property of indigenous people. So when we're talking about indigeneity today, we're talking about something which is seen from the perspective of political power, not simply as something which belongs to indigenous people, but something which in effect anybody can be, anybody can become. That's why the book is called Becoming Indigenous. It's about this idea that indigeneity is in essence a kind of skill set, a way of being in the world, which anybody in theory can achieve, ought to be able to achieve, if they are able to learn. And we're very critical, for reasons that I'll go into, about this argument, about this idea of thinking about indigeneity and detaching it from the actual lives, the actual communities and histories of indigenous people. It's also the argument which is made in the book of my researchers, my colleagues, Mario Lindroth and Heidi Sinivara Nuskanen. In their book, we're working together on this project, and they've written and published this book, which is called Global Politics and Its Violent Care for Indigeneity. And I recommend, if you're interested in this topic, I strongly recommend Heidi and Mario's book, because it's an excellent intro to the ways in which this politics of indigeneity is working today in international relations. It's also a kind of approach that you can see in wider Arctic scholarship, especially in some of the anthropology of indigeneity in the Arctic. I want to reference another book, which I'm a big fan of, by a Canadian anthropologist called Lisa Stevenson. This book came out 6 years ago, and it's called Life Beside Itself, Imagining Care in the Canadian Arctic. And essentially it's a book about the experience of the Inuit in the north of Canada, and the ways in which they have experienced this particular shift from old school racism and colonialism to this post-colonial desire to care for the indigenous of post-colonial states and regimes of power. It's a beautifully written book, and I can't recommend it strong enough. It's rare that you come across an academic text that you really want to read from beginning to end, but from the moment you open this text and start to read it, it will grip you with the history and with the ethnography that she provides the reader, an ethnography which details the experience of the Inuit, firstly in the 1950s and 1960s, of the intervention of the Canadian state on account of the TB, tuberculosis epidemic, which was occurring there at the time, and the ways in which Inuit were violently transported from their homes to the south of Canada to receive treatment, irrespective of their wishes to remain with their communities and families and in their own homes. And then she takes you through the suicide crisis which emerges, especially in Nunavut, the northernmost region of Canada, mostly in this present century, and the ways in which the Canadian state intervention into that suicide crisis, supposedly on behalf of the Inuit in order to care for them and to prevent them from dying, etc., how that was experienced by the Inuit as a very violent mode of care, regardless of its desire to care for the biological life of them as a community and as individual subjects. Something about that intervention, Stevenson argued, produced an immense dissonance within Inuit communities, only generating further suicide. And she poses really vital and interesting questions about the politics of suicide itself as an act, as a resistance to biopolitical regimes of power, in ways that play into wider debates in wider social science and international relations about a range of different forms of resistance to biopolitics, not least suicide bombing, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot to be said and thought about in terms of the biopolitics of indigeneity in the Arctic. Yeah, so she's looking at the relation between the Inuit and the Canadian state. And one thing that I've noticed in our discussions is that when we're talking about the Arctic, we're often still talking about the power of nation states, and our analytic tends to be very oriented towards talking about it in that way. One thing I want to insist on is the importance of this new regional organization in the Arctic, that is to say the Arctic Council, which has existed since the 1990s, and which is a very deliberate and important, and in some senses progressive attempt to govern the whole Arctic region internationally by bringing Arctic states together, to think together, to collaborate together, to communicate in alignment and in communication with and in recognition of the power and importance of the various councils of indigenous peoples of the Arctic. So this is a very interesting and relevant experiment in transnationalism. Something which came up yesterday, it came up in the discussion after the first panel, it came up again in the course of the discussions around the second panel, whether transnationalism is the answer to the limits of the nation states. Personally, I would argue that you should be very critical and circumspect about any argument for the progressive nature of transnational governance over and against the nation states. It's not clear to me from the research that I've done, either around the Arctic or in wider international relations, that these alternative systems of international organization do really provide the meaningful alternative, the less violent way of governing people globally and in the Arctic. And in my work, I've been very critical about Arctic Council policies and practices, especially with respect to their approach to something called resilience. Resilience is a topic and a concept that I've been researching for a while now. I've published a couple of books on the topic. In 2014, Resilient Life with my friend Brad Evans came out. And then in 2016, the neoliberal subject, Resilience, Adaptivity, and Vulnerability, which was the first book that I wrote with David Chandler, who was also the author of this book on indigeneity. And what we argue in our work, in both of those books, is that resilience is really a concept that is about neoliberalism. It's a strategy, it's a technique, it's a project, it's the concept in a way which neoliberalism is most deeply invested in globally, and now definitely in the Arctic via the Arctic Council. That resilience is all about dismantling people's political capacities, political subjectivity, denying them security or even the ability to ask for security and protection from state power or any other institutional form of power. And it's a way of legitimizing the responsibilization of citizens, of individuals and groups and communities, making people assume the burden of responsibility for all the disasters and catastrophes which are going to be coming at us over the course of this century on account of the Anthropocene, and on account, of course, of the nature of neoliberal governance, given that it turns people over to the whims of a neoliberal economy. So, yeah, I'm very critical of the Arctic Council for its investment in resilience as a strategy for the whole wider region. Not least because there's also a biopolitics to resilience. What is resilience? Well, resilience is defined as the capacity of somebody, be it an individual, or be it a community, or be it a whole society, to cope with the trauma which comes with the experience of disasters. It describes the ability of the subject to adapt to the event of disasters and catastrophes, and to cope and to go on living, to be able to survive and to absorb the shock which occurs on account of one's experience of disasters. Biologists as well as ecologists say it's the fundamental property of every single living system, that this is the nature of what it is to be alive, in a certain sense, in the world. To live is to be, also in kind of Judith Butler's own terms, it's to be vulnerable, it's to be at risk of inevitable exposure and experience of disasters, and nevertheless to be able to bounce back and cope with that experience. Today, when we look at the Arctic Council and their strategy of resilience, we can see that they are promoting the idea that it's also a property of specifically indigenous peoples, that indigenous peoples are especially good at resilience, be it the Sami, be it the Nanets, or be it the Inuit. That when we're looking at the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, we're looking at people who are especially skilled at resilience, and that they have a lot to teach the wider world about how to be resilient. That is to say, how to be able to cope and bounce back from the experience of trauma and disasters. And they celebrate in their various reports on resilience in the Arctic the success of indigenous peoples historically, but also in the present and in the future, because resilience today is seen to be the abilities to cope and adapt with the realities and the disasters and the catastrophes that are coming at us on account of the Anthropocene, and to be able to cope and change one's life and change oneself in order to be able to survive the Anthropocene. And the argument which I've been making in my book and wider work is that while this on the surface of things would seem to be about celebrating indigenous people, celebrating indigeneity, extolling the virtues of indigeneity, this is really the nature of the new racism. It's a racism which functions not by calling people inferior or putting them at the bottom of that hierarchy which Terike was talking about in her earlier presentation. It's a racism which functions by apparently putting indigenous peoples on a pedestal, making them out to be especially skilled and especially valuable, but really exposing them, really naturalizing their catastrophes, naturalizing their historical traumas, and celebrating this capacity to cope with and survive the experience of trauma, and using it as a model also for the rest of humanity, saying that everybody can learn from indigenous historical experience and indigenous capacities, and with living with very harsh and difficult circumstances, to be able to survive the neoliberal future. So it's a new kind of racism which functions through valorization rather than by making people out to be inferior. So we have to change our very definition and understanding of what racism is and how it works today to see how this colonialism is working. Not least because it raises the question of what happens to indigenous people when they can't fit within, when they happen not to fit within this particular image of indigeneity as being resilient, adaptive, etc. What about those people, those indigenous people who, for whatever reason, happen not to be especially resilient, happen not to be especially good at coping with trauma? For example, the suicidal members of Inuit communities, are they somehow less indigenous because they're not being resilient? what happens to Indigenous people whose knowledge doesn't meet the criteria also of Indigenous knowledge? This takes me back actually to Medina's presentation on Friday evening when she was making this claim. And it's a claim that you hear often, that Indigenous peoples are exemplary at sustainability, that Indigenous peoples almost don't know how to live unsustainably. I think this is a very dangerous kind of claim because it puts a lot of weight, a lot of responsibility onto Indigenous peoples. And, you know, listening to Indigenous people, Samis, local Sami people, activists talking about these kind of arguments, they don't necessarily like hearing it because it puts so much responsibility on them to live up to a particular kind of model of indigeneity. And indeed, we don't have to go very far to find examples of where this logic, where this reasoning breaks down and where it becomes deeply problematic and political. So earlier this year, I published an article in the journal called Anthropocenes, which is about the conflicts raging at the moment between the Inuit and the colonial Canadian states over the migration of polar bears. You might have heard about this, you might not, but at the moment there is this massive conflict between the Inuit and the Canadian state and Canadian state science, especially ecological science, over the significance of the migration of polar bears. Everybody knows that polar bears are moving south on account, apparently, of the declining sea ice. And the Inuit have been arguing that they would like to cull the bears, that they think that there are too many bears around their communities, and that in fact, there's no problem with the survival of the polar bears. They argue that their indigenous knowledge helps them to see the resilience of the polar bear. The polar bear for the Inuit is the ultimate resilient subject. The Canadian state says, no, that's wrong. We have ecologists who are able to tell us that these bears are in trouble and that we have to protect the bear. So you have a massive clash of knowledge, a clash between the indigenous knowledge of the Inuit, which is saying, let's kill the bears, there's too many bears and they're a danger to us. And then the Canadian state with its Western ecological science saying that we need to care for the bears, that the bears are in danger and the Inuit have no right to go and hunt too many polar bears because these bears are already facing the possibility of extinction as a species. And this argument came to a head in the summer of 2018 when one Inuit, one father, was killed by a polar bear as he fought to defend his children from that bear, which was very close to his family. And there have been, I think, other deaths too. So this is a really interesting kind of conflict, I think, between the post-colonial state of Canada, which is arguing on ecological grounds for the necessity to protect the bear, over and against the interests of this human community of Inuit. And the Inuit, on the other hand, arguing that it's necessary and that they would like to take out the bears, kill the bears, in order to defend themselves. Not least because of what it tells us about debates on the relationship between indigeneity and post-humanism. We've heard a lot about post-humanism over the last couple of days in various presentations, including Terike's great presentation, which began the panel. But, you know, Western critical theory today is more or less awash with attempts to align itself with indigenous knowledge. Various strands and streams within Western critical theory are talking about indigenous knowledge as a means through which to develop a more post-human framework, to overcome the limits of humanism and the legacies of humanism in the Western political theoretical tradition. Classic examples would be, for example, the work of Daniel Haraway or Timothy Morton. There's any number of different theorists and their schools, their disciples who make this kind of argument that if we can just make the shift towards indigenous knowledge, then we can create a more post-human framework of theorizing and analyzing. So my question is, well, what does this conflict between the Inuit and the Canadian state tell us about the limits of this assumption about relations between indigenous knowledge, indigeneity, and post-humanism? Because here you have a human community of indigenous people, the Inuit, arguing for their greater importance over and against the lives and well-being of polar bears. They want to hunt the polar bears, take out the polar bears. You know, post-humanism is the kind of, I think, as I see it, a new consensus in social science, especially in anthropology. You know, all the while the anthropologists talk about how marginal they are on account of their post-humanism, they continue to argue that humanism is the dominant paradigm, and that post-humanism is this marginal position which needs greater work and greater research to assert its validity and importance. But you know, if you open up journals of anthropology, read the work that wins the big prizes in anthropology, it's all post-humanism. Post-humanism is the dominant paradigm, and it's dominant on account of its abilities to lay claim to a legitimacy which depends upon its representation of indigenous culture and indigenous knowledge as being essentially post-humanist. But if you look at the lives and practices and the theory and the thoughts and the philosophy and the mythologies of different indigenous peoples, including the Inuit, I think you get a very different view of the relationships of these peoples to animals through practices of hunting, for example, which treat animals as essentially gifts from the gods, to be exploited on their own behalf, and certainly to be protected against when those animals, such as polar bears, come too close to your communities and families. And I have a great deal of sympathy for the Inuit perspective, but I'm also very skeptical for the same reasons about the way in which indigeneity is being appropriated today, not just by colonial states and colonial international organizations, but by Western critical theory, because Western critical theory, as far as I'm concerned, is part of the problem of post-colonialism today. It's doing the work, providing the ideas and the research to legitimate these violent ways of mistreating indigenous people, including the Inuit, by the colonial Canadian state. As we move towards the end of the presentation, I think this is really important for the arts and for the Arctic arts especially. It seems to me that when we're looking at the arts as a regime of governance, as a field of production which is political, you can see that both post-humanism and indigeneity are very, very popular. The biennales and so on and so forth. There's a shift, there's a dramatic shift which mirrors the political shift towards apparently, on the surface of things, promoting indigenous arts and promoting the post-human agenda in the arts. And often these two things can be seen as coming together and also combining in interesting ways with resilience. So there's another paper which came out late last year, which I wrote about the ways in which the reconciliation process in Canada, the so-called Truth and Reconciliation process in Canada, this attempt of the Canadian colonial state to cement its hegemony in indigenous communities and in the Canadian Arctic North, has led to massive investment in the arts. And for example, in 2016, the curating of the so-called Resilience Billboard exhibition. This was an exhibition which was apparently designed to promote indigenous artists, and especially indigenous women artists, through putting their visual art up on billboards in different places around the country, on highways and so on and so forth. But all within this framework of resilience, the idea that indigenous art could be boiled down to this basic overarching concept and framework of resilience. It was called the Resilience Billboard exhibition. And if you Google it, if you go onto the website, you can read the introduction to the project by the Canadian curator Lee Ann Martin, where she basically does all the things which and plays out all the cliches which I've just described. This way of thinking about indigeneity and describing indigenous people as exemplars of resilience. This is exactly what she says about the indigenous peoples of Canada, and then takes you through, I think, the work of 50 different indigenous women artists, and says basically that every one of the pieces of artwork in this exhibition is a manifestation of the wonder of resilience. And there's a particular piece which I sent to Maria and Anna to use to advertise the talk. It's a very beautiful work called Fringe by an artist called Rebecca Belmore, which exemplifies this this motif. And I can see that Maria's just shared the piece. Thank you very much. If you look at it, you can see that it's the body. It's a very beautiful and aesthetic body of a woman, showing her back. And as you look at it to begin with, you see maybe a hair braid, classic kind of icon of indigenous practices. But on closer inspection, you start to see that in fact it's a wound. And there's a kind of aestheticization of the wound going on in this piece, which exemplifies the very idea of resilience, the idea that the idea of the capacity of the body to absorb trauma and to aestheticize the absorption of trauma is very interesting, I think. So yeah, I think that in the arts, we can also see that resilience is a discourse which is functioning to naturalize the trauma and vulnerability of indigenous experience and subjectivity. You know, where is the art, I would like to ask, which contributes not simply to the resilience of indigenous peoples, but the resistance and capacities for political subjectivity of indigenous peoples? I was very struck yesterday listening to the talk and the presentation about the situation in Shears and this amazing story of the manifestation of political subjectivity in that community. And I would like to draw parallels between that story and the importance of, for example, in Finnish Lapland, of the Sami activist art movement and project known as Suopantera, which I'm sure you're all quite familiar with. The ways in which this poster art or propaganda art associated with Suopantera is working to assert the political subjectivity of the Sami, their refusal to accept and adapt to the social and political conditions which are being foisted upon them by the Finnish state and wider colonial states and regimes of power. Also, their abilities to appropriate elements and icons of modernity to manifest a politics of resistance. Also, the violence has to be said. You know, we're here to talk about non-violence. I'm not sure that non-violence is always necessarily the answer. There's a violence to the images of Suopantera in terms of their resistance to colonialism, which is also essential to recognize and even valorize over and against investing in the power of non-violence, as Judith Butler and many others, it has to be said, argue for. So to end, I would say that recalling the great book by Felix Guattari, The Three Ecologies, a book which I was very happy to see was referenced in the description of the symposium. I love this book. You know, in that book, The Three Ecologies, Felix Guattari talks about the importance of ecology, not just as a practice and a science designed to and aimed at saving living species of life biologically understood, but what he calls in that book incorporeal species which exist in this world without any kind of corporealized body. And it seems to me that the political, this immense and perhaps possibly singular capacity of human beings, of humanity, over and against every other living species and animal, this capacity for politics is something which is at risk of becoming extinct and which needs saving in this late advanced era of neoliberal modernity and resilience. And yeah, I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian. I just wanted to say to our technical team, could you please let Terike into the Zoom because she was out and she needs to get in. Yeah. So thank you very much, Julian. It was very, I would say, a complex explanation of understanding of how to be indigenous and what sort of problems somehow concentrated around this definition and about the processes that are happening within indigenous community. Like, I think you really covered all these important stereotypes and cliches that are traveling from between academia and artistic domain, literature, and also, I guess, some public knowledge about it. So I would like to introduce Egor Rogalev, who I would really want to hear. We really want to hear your take on these two presentations and maybe some of your comments on the previous panels. If you were present, Egor is a curator and writer and artist from St. Petersburg. Whose practice touches upon the transition from documentary photography to contemporary post-media art, which expand the horizons of previous research and gave wide scope to experimentation with large-scale installation, video, sound, and performance. Egor is a member of editorial board of Moscow Art Magazine. It's an important Russian critical publication, which a group of which is led by an interesting editorial board since 1993. And from 2020, from the beginning of this year, Egor also takes part in working group of the Assembly. It's a new initiative, and Egor is co-founder, co-initiator of this initiative. It's a new space which soon to be open in St. Petersburg. And the main idea of Assembly as a space, as also a discursive platform to accumulate all academic and artistic grassroots practices that have a critical view on local and global political and social processes. And we're especially happy to invite Egor because in the hype of the pandemic in the spring, he launched a series of online conversations which called Changing Landscape, and with a group of invited artists and performers and critics from different parts of Russia. He launched conversations about the politics of care by looking at such definitions as planetary structures, understanding of body, the notion of normativity, and I think that's I was following these discussions, and it was very interesting to look and be somehow distantly part of this discourse. And Egor, please join in, and we'll be happy to hear your thoughts and reflections on presented presentations.
Hello, everyone, and thanks a lot for such detailed introduction and for inviting me to this panel as a discussant. And since this panel is the last one, and today we also will, I think, somehow finalize the whole symposium or summarize it, I would love to start with getting back to the title, because I mentioned the difference between its Russian and English version, and the word used in Russian version, it doesn't only mean a condition, but also a need, a necessity, or an emergency. And because of that, I find the Russian version much more precise and accurate, since it refers to all those meanings at once. I don't know if it could be possible to find such a word that in English that can reflect all these meanings, but I think this panel demonstrated the importance of these additional meanings which appeared in the Russian version. And when I started to think of how I can participate here, I immediately recalled a fairy tale of Mansi people, an Ugric nation from Western Siberia and Northern Ural Mountains, which I know from my childhood, from the Soviet book, the collection of the fairy tales of Western Siberian nations. And this fairy tale is called The Fury of Taiga. And I'm mentioning it.
What is the Russian title?
Гнев Тайги. The Fury of Taiga. And I'm mentioning it first of all because, in my opinion, it is a great example of how interdependency and also somehow the non-violent coexistence was presented in the mythologies and beliefs of the indigenous societies of Russian North. And also it refers to these concepts, I think, a bit in the same way as Symposium, as to a condition, a need, and a necessity. And now I also think it really resonates to what we've heard in Terike's presentation and also Julian's talk somehow, and also with this mentioned Judith Butler's quote about construction of ourselves through relations with the others. And yeah, this fairy tale tells a story. I would just summarize the plot of the small tribe that started to exploit natural resources to the point that the exploitation resulted in the scarcity and the famine. And when it has happened, a member of the tribe, a very old man, the only person who was not taking part in this violent exploitation, went in the heart of the woods of Taiga to establish the dialogue with the spirits. And there he met a really, really small gray bird that suddenly asked him about what he's doing there. And it turned out that the bird itself was this spirit, a fury of Taiga, a spirit that changes from kindness to fury depending on how people act, and brings famine and diseases when people start to act violently to the woods and its inhabitants. In the end of the conversation, the old man has managed to reestablish relations with the spirits, and the tribe and people have made an agreement to set up certain limits to the use of natural resources. What's interesting about this myth in the context of this panel? First of all, I think its symbolism shows us that even a very small agent of an environment, a tiny bird, could be of a great importance for keeping the whole system in balance. And also because I think it also exemplifies how these beliefs of the indigenous nations served as the regulators that defined the relation within the societies and also between these societies and the environments. And these relations are both, by no doubt, connected and intertwined. And also we can hardly see the difference between human and non-human. I think they may differ functionally, but not ontologically within this worldview. And also, I think in this case, the relations could be also seen as essential, not just norms, but also the way how people feel and how they related to the environment. And what I think my conclusion is that in our time, the purpose of the culture, and especially the contemporary art and theory, could be the same. And of course, it's important, as Julian has mentioned, not to idealize blindly this indigenous communities, and as well not to see. It's important to pay attention to the difference between all those communities. But what came to my mind after this example with this polar bear controversy, that is Canadian Inuits, they have actually already experienced the modernization. And I think they use modern weapons, and that's what gives them ability to kill much more polar bears than they can do without them. But I agree that this controversy is very interesting and also exemplary. And I find the idea of Symposium to be really important. I would love to thank the organizers and participants of this panel and other panels for speaking of the significant topics and presenting really essential projects that can transform and regulate our relations to the environment, not only in a rational and scientific way, which of course is very important, but also speaking of art, I think we should mention the other level, which could be also interpreted rationally, but which is, let's say, more phenomenological and sensual. And by that, I mean the transformation of our attention and perception towards the new forms of sensibility, which could be, if we use Jane Bennett's term, ecological sensibility. With this, I think we can not only see interdependency as a concept, but can relate to it as a very logic of life. And it's possible to make it a part of our daily experience that can influence our the way how we act toward others, humans and non-humans, in our environment, which Bruno Latour defined as a critical zone. I really like this term. I think it's really accurate because the image of this thin layer down in the soil and up in the atmosphere where organic matter can exist, the layer which is very vulnerable and insecure, and which destiny depends on every part and every agent included in it. And that's why the idea of the community without exclusion and the vulnerability of the bodies presented in the works of Terike is very powerful and important. So, yeah, I think it's all.
That's a great comment, Egor. Thank you so much. You really put things together, and with this example of this fairy tale, it's also brought all this memory about all these myths that were part of our Soviet childhood somehow. Now they read completely differently and could be interpreted completely differently. I want to be very practical here, and my question is maybe mostly for Julian, but also for Terike as well, who really in her presentation tried to shake this white supremacy full of disparity and lack of decency. And speaking about indigenous knowledge, so Julian said, like, we all can be indigenous. But I guess my question is, like, what do you particularly have learned by looking at different communities? What have you learned about, like, how would you like to live? I can, or should live, or like share with us these observations, because I, for instance, what I've learned, I recently watched this film called, a documentary film by Rachel O'Reilly. It's called Gas Imaginary. It's also like a film as a part of her long-term project, where she researched the implications of gas tube that goes through the land of Aboriginal people in Australia. And in the film, they say about the drama of all of this, that this land is occupied by leading gas company, is because they feel failed. They didn't save this land for future generations, because they live in order to think, to save, to preserve their culture, their land, their natural resources for future generations. Not to use it even by themselves, but rather this is their life goal to do it. So, like, can you share maybe like very similar or totally different knowledge? So, speaking about particular things, I just think, like, if we can just maybe brainstorm and come up with examples.
Sure, thanks very much for the question. I think the first thing I want to say is that for me, there is absolutely no binary here in terms of the distinction and relationship between indigenous peoples and other non-indigenous peoples. And I think this is also one of the big problems I have with elements of Western critical theory today, in terms of its construction of this very binary. And often you're dealing with thinkers who talk about the problem of binaries, right? For example, Medina on Friday, someone starts out by talking about how binaries are a Western problematic. And then they go on to construct this whole new binary between indigenous and non-indigenous or Western colonial peoples and ways of being. For me, it's a nonsense. The things which I'm interested in discovering and reading about in the cultures and encountering the knowledge and practices of indigenous peoples are exactly the same stuff which I'm interested in when I look at my own culture or form of knowledge, or any other form of knowledge or culture worldwide. What fascinates me as a political thinker and scientist are the capacities of cultures and peoples to strategize, to inhabit power relations, and to contest and go into conflict with other actors and other agencies within complex power relations. So when I'm reading about indigeneity, and that's the human stuff which I'm essentially interested in. If you look at the Sami culture, Sami language, one of the fascinating things about it is that the word for language itself is the same as the word for trap. Giela. It means language. It also means trap. So, I mean, for me, that's exemplary of this kind of way of thinking about the cunning of language itself as a medium through which you have to navigate and strategize and politicize in order to find your way, the intelligence. So, the ways of thinking which shape indigenous approaches to language, indigenous approaches to power, are often consistent with the ways in which they approach the natural world of their relationship with other species, the ways in which they trap other animals in order to be able to capture other life forms and live off others. For me, that's totally fascinating, and it's an element of indigenous cultures as much as it's an element of every other culture, including fundamentally the West itself, given that the West would never have developed and become what it did without the very same forms of intelligence, what the Greeks called metis, the cunning, the ability to strategize and to outwit each other and the other, and to disempower and to predate other bodies. I mean, that's what's always most fascinating about human cultures, whether indigenous or not. For me, there's no binary.
Yeah. Julian, I also wanted to ask you and go back a little bit to your talk and talk about the old racism and new racism. And I was wondering how you define the beginning of new racism. Do you connect it to neoliberalism, or how do we talk about it? Because the example that you brought about resilience of indigenous people and how this resilience is being put on the pedestal and this kind of positive racism, it made me also think about Jews and the Holocaust, and Jews will manage everywhere because they survived the Holocaust, and this discourse is not so new. So how would you define this kind of different stages of racism, and is it really new or is it just continuation? And could you just maybe talk a little bit about the conditions in which this new racism is shaping?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. It's a good question. Of course, it's important to recognize and to examine the ways in which these processes, this new form of racism, is predicated upon a long and very difficult history of the struggle for recognition and emancipation of indigenous peoples, right? So for a long time, the indigenous, to use that very violent phrase, because when we're talking about the indigenous, we're talking about very diverse, different groups, different struggles, different situations, socio-political conditions. But for a long time, indigenous peoples' encounter with the world of settler colonialism was an encounter defined by the experience of being seen as inferior, being seen as the subhuman species, as Terike was saying in her presentation, the human being, which is too close to the animal in its conditions of existence and ways of being, the inferior being, the inferiority of which legitimates its colonization and even attempts at its extermination. That was the origin of the experience, and against that they have struggled for some kind of recognition, some kind of emancipation, some kind of empowerment, which has gradually, in a certain way and in very important ways, been realized over the last 70 years. From the end of the Second World War to the present, we have seen indigenous peoples achieving various kinds of success in terms of their capacity to develop their own systems of representation, their own legal enfranchisements, recognition of their own, the validity and the value of their own cultures and of indigenous knowledge and so forth. So it's important to recognize that we're also talking about a history of empowerment and the struggle for recognition and equality, and that history has its own logics and its own motors. At some point in time, fairly recently, gradually, over the last, I would say, 40 years, dating from the early 1970s, maybe, we start to see Western regimes of governance. Going back to the 40s, they're already making corrections to the ways in which they govern the indigenous. And that book by Lisa Stevenson on the Inuit in Canada it's a brilliant history. You won't read a better piece of Arctic scholarship on Arctic governance of indigenous peoples. Gradually the state learns to change its disposition and to care for indigenous people, to express a kind of benevolence. That benevolence, as she describes in the book, initially it wasn't about recognizing the equality of the Inuit. Inuit will continue to be treated very badly as inferior beings in their experience of the care of the Canadian state on account of the TB pandemic, which was occurring in Inuit communities as well as throughout wider Canada in the 50s and 60s. Somewhere gradually you'd have to have a proper historian to do the proper genealogy. But somewhere, I think, over the last 30 or 40 years, we see, on account of the rise of environmental reason, on account of the realization of the unsustainability of old school industrial economies and the failings of modernity, we start to see the West reassessing indigenous peoples and indigenous knowledge, seeing the indigenous in a new light, not simply as objects of necessary care on account of the benevolence of there being liberal states committed to principles of universality and so forth, but seeing the indigenous actually as a resource, as an alternative to the limits of Western economic reason, and gradually beginning to valorize indigeneity. And what's important to recognize about this historical epoch of the last 30 to 40 years is, of course, this is precisely the epoch of neoliberalism, right? So this is the period in which neoliberalism is rising as a regime of economy and politics predicated upon new understandings as to the necessity of socioeconomic inequality and of the desire to, in a certain sense, get away with the states, right? The old school welfare social states. This is the enemy of the neoliberal project. They want to shift responsibility onto citizens, onto society itself, onto the life of populations, to teach people to care for themselves. Gradually, within this process, regimes start to look at the indigenous as exemplars of the very properties and capacities that they're interested in developing in their own non-indigenous populations. So the indigenous, it's useful for neoliberal regimes to look at the indigenous and celebrate the indigenous for their resilience, because it allows them to be disparaging about the limits and capacities of their own non-indigenous populations. So they start to say, hey, look at these indigenous people. They have survived over centuries without assistance, even projects aimed at their extermination. They're capable also of living with extreme weather conditions, of coping with ecological catastrophes. Isn't this precisely the future which our wider populations are faced with? And can we use these indigenous peoples as a model on which to convince our own non-indigenous populations as to the viability of resilience as a mode of life, as a way of life? So, it's hard to date, but there is that's a broad overview, I think, of the history through which this new racism has emerged and become prevalent. And it's very seductive. It's not easy to see this as racism, because on the surface of things, it seems to be about putting the indigenous on a pedestal, saying, look how successful they are, how able they are at coping and absorbing the shocks and the impact of disasters and getting on with it and not expecting too much. And resilience is all about limiting expectations. It's about the abilities of states and sovereigns to say to their people, hey, we can't help you anymore. We don't exist to help you anymore. You have to learn to help yourselves and to be self-sufficient now and in the future. And rather than investing in those old modernist ideals of progress and development and improvement, learn something from the indigenous about sustainability and resilience, and about just staying where you are and not demanding too much from political power.
Yeah. And in this context, I also wanted to, also discuss the recent news, the fact that the Finnish pavilion will be Sami pavilion and the next biennial, and maybe also curators could jump into discussion, Katja, Christina, and Taro. And because when Ani and I were in Norway in residency, we were there a few times in the north of Norway, we were often hearing from Sami artists I think a very reasonable statement that they don't want to be presented often as Sami artists just because they feel that they're being put in certain framework or cage that kind of diminishes their artistic practice. So is having a Sami pavilion is a step towards giving this more equal platform for Sami artists, or is it still an attempt, and maybe this kind of blind attempt to put them in a certain position that is not so favorable for them, being benevolent, but at the same time causing some sort of harm to their practice and their position in the art world?
Yeah, or is it simply like this greenwashing of Finnish government or Ministry of Culture or international relations?
Can I just jump in? And I have a question. Do we have indigenous people on the conference at the moment?
No, we don't.
So I think maybe we should pause a little bit and just look a little bit about how actually this situation is reproducing structures of othering and exclusion, because I find it quite problematic the way this conversation is turning around, talking in a little bit patronizing way about indigeneity as something that is like an intellectual problem. And so I'm thinking, I understand the question of the problem of a binary, which is a problem of any identity politics. I in my understanding that identities are always imposed by the powers that be, and that are, like labels that are imprinted by the oppressor. But if you don't acknowledge those positions, if you don't think that those positions to speak are valuable or validated, you kind of are in danger of ending up in a very problematic politics of colorblindness that we see, for example, in France or different places where this kind of identifying is clearly just forbidden. And so I think there are reasons why this is an all Western or all European encounter that we're having here, and that I'm also reminded of one scholar, Kim Thalberg, that I really admire, and her work is a lot about on family and relationships in relationship to family, but she's has this kind of open question of regarding whiteness, and I think I've been thinking about that a lot, and how whiteness as a category, as this original category of a race, is so fluctuating and kind of easily, like moldable into including or excluding anything that happens to be useful at any given moment. And she was saying that at one encounter or conference, a colleague posed a question of the possibility of like post-racial whiteness and what that could be, and she responded to this and thought somehow this resonates, and that maybe one way in which whiteness persists outside any phenotypes or any sort of like other apparatuses is rationality. Of course, she's working in the academia, and I think there is also something to say about the way in which the discourses that we're engaged with are using rationality in a way that's actually imposing a certain norm of intellect and knowledge and reproducing this like subject-object binary, actually. And so personally, like I would like to hear from you, but I would kind of be very happy to shift the focus a little bit on our speculation about what might some people who are not present think about these things, into thinking of like what are we reproducing here, and maybe also thinking about maybe this is a question for us also to think about, which comes from my colleague Pablo Ramirez, who's a curator of indigenous art at Tate, and in a talk he gave recently, he talked about his collaboration with the Maya, which he's a friend, so been talking about these things a lot, and he talked about the difficulty of working with Mayan artists in a way that doesn't essentialize indigenous art as being like something. It's not like one thing, like that's come up here also. And partly because the way in which in a lot of the Mayan communities that he's working with, his words, the kind of creativity is in the service of reproduction of life, meaning in the service of like continuing traditions or in different ways of reproducing life and culture. And what I kind of got from that was thinking of how our art and discourse is so much about reproduction of death, and it's like literally our museums are places and sites of cutting connections to lived communities based on individuality, based on this very this ideal of an neoliberal subject that's like an entrepreneur of their own survival. And so maybe the question for us would be like, how can we bring our practices without resorting to any notion of indigeneity? How can we resort our practices and dismantle our work and practices so that it would also be in the service of reproduction of life instead of it being in the service of reproduction of death?
But we can also like think about indigenous not like othering, but rather finding this connection to the natural processes and to the land and to the where we are from as something which also can put us into category of this community that cares about processes and try to maybe learn from each other as well. So I don't think we want to kind of to other, but rather to engage. So yes, it's maybe we don't have within our discussion today someone who would represent like a community which we're not part of, but it doesn't mean that we're not open for thinking about it.
Important to remember though that care can also be, often is also about othering. This is also not a necessary distinction as such. This is the great take home from the book by Stevenson on the Inuits' experience of the care, the biopolitical care of the Canadian state. They're totally alienated by the mode of care, the way in which their lives are objectified through practices of care, to the point of no longer wanting to live, to no longer wanting to experience this mode of care. Such was the violence with which that care was experienced. So it's also very important to think about the limits, the dangers, the violences of care itself, and that's one of the things which I think different indigenous peoples have to tell us about the post-colonial condition, that care is not benign either.
By care, I actually meant not caring about groups of indigenous people, but caring about processes, reflecting on the processes that are happening within like our communities or our countries, or like reflecting on some other processes, socio-political processes that are happening in the world. So by caring, I was meaning that being in conversation with like-minded people as well. Yeah, that's what I meant. Okay. But Katya Sharova, could you please, I think you have a comment, maybe you can join. Katya? Okay, I don't think she's here. More questions or comments?
Maybe I could.
Я буду рада сказать комментарий, если вы попросите спикеров переключиться на язык перевода.
So first Christina and then Taro.
Yeah.
And otherwise Christina will be speaking in Russian. So if you could please switch to the Russian channel.
Yeah, you go to the Globus and then you switch to what? English, I think.
Christina, what shall we switch to? На что нам нужно нажать? Русский или английский? Что?
На
Вы
что
сделали
нажать?
это?
Так на что нажать? На русский или английский?
На английский перевод.
Okay. Yeah, everyone, push the button where there is a globus, there is this English. If you could switch into the... Okay.
And then you will hear translated question.
Все получилось?
They managed to do it? Perfect. I would like to comment. I want to comment on Julian's phrase because it really talked to my heart during the preparation of the exhibition, which
возвращение. Я осмысляла ее
reevaluate through different works of various philosophers, and I studied their diaries, the representatives of indigenous populations that worked here in Russia, in the northwest of Russia, from 1930s till the late 90s of the last century. Thank you, Maria, for the link. And it seemed to me it was pretty important to read a comment from one of the diaries that comes from an artist. It's a Nenetsky artist, representative of the indigenous population, and he wrote the following. Life on the island is interconnected with work. But it is not explained by the character of time. It is explained and based on the nature and the habitat. For the Western culture, labor is something that is imposed by the society, something that you have to do. I view work as a source of life energy, fortifying my body and gaining life energy. I took 3 sons with me to work in the field. Successful fishing and hunting makes an Nenets indigenous person more confident. And despite the universal pessimistic attitude of a European person, the perception of a Nenets artist is peaceful. The human being as a constant care forms in the Nenets world picture the feeling of compatibility with nature, and that life cannot be separated from the place of living. The meaning of loneliness here plays an important place. In the Western philosophy, a person tries to stay alone and deeply rooted into his thoughts. That's it. So this is my comment. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Christina. Tara, did you also want to add something or comment on something?
I don't think I have anything too much to add, except that I would want to make a small correction. You mentioned the Finnish pavilion becoming Sami pavilion. It's actually the Nordic pavilion, which I think is really crucial, because the Nordic pavilion is the only transnational pavilion in the old Biennale area in Venice, and to actually kind of very much the kind of fitting context the Sami pavilion. And I would also like to add that I think maybe commenting on this what this means, I think this is exactly what we should be asking the Sami artists and activists. But I would like to sort of emphasize that OKA in Norway has been working for very kind of focused on working with the Sami for well over 5 years now in their programming, and so this is I think we have to kind of think here about this sort of embeddedness and the necessity to engage and embed oneself critically and situate oneself critically in these dialogues with the different communities that we work with, whether it's indigenous or other communities, but especially in this kind of ongoing colonial situations like Nordic countries. And so I think OKA has been really exemplary in terms of how they've actually approached this, and how such a kind of a very long-term engagement and engaging the kind of really kind of different, diverse parts of the community up north in this sort of dialogue. And so I think the kind of going back to what Terike was saying earlier, I think it's really critical here that we actually look at our own practices and what are those kind of genealogies of where our practices and methodologies come from, and what kind of what sort of genealogies they're part of, and what we carry with us, and how actually a lot of our practices and methodologies in the sciences and different disciplines and in the arts are very much part of this sort of ongoing colonial legacies, and I think that kind of critical positioning in relation to this is sort of where we have to start from before we can even think of how do we understand kind of, or how do we approach that kind of dialogue, and the kind of some sort of rebalance maybe the kind of the dialogue with whether it's a kind of indigenous communities in a really plural sense. Because even looking at the Sami, I think it's kind of from without going further into that now, because I think we really would have to have the Sami members here in the dialogue with us. It's an extremely complex and diverse situation. It's a kind of very different political histories across the north, and ongoing current situations that we have to really always bear in mind. But that's all.
Yeah, we tried to include like some Sami artists, but those we approached, yeah, and they couldn't participate due to different regions. It's not reasons, not that we didn't think about it. And I think like with our symposium, we're really happy to join this process of reparation of history, which our colleagues from Arctic Art Forum are doing for the last several years. And I think Christina's exhibition Homecoming is a great possibility to actually like look at the history and give voices of alive and non-alive Sami artists from the high north of Russia, and then to sort of because those works on such big platform as like internet, and they've been just buried somewhere in archives of national museums, and those artists being known locally but never being known outside of local art community. And I think it's great that like our conversation with this symposium touching upon local and like global processes that happening also outside of Arctic region. And I think it's I hope we are contributing some valuable information to the platform of Artistic Art Forum.
Yeah, I was looking at that today. Beautiful.
Yeah, and it's interesting also, like, we are, as I mentioned yesterday, like after the presentation of Susan Shupley and Christina and Katya, that we are dealing a lot now with the aftermath and implications of Soviet project that really try to exclude everything which stands out from this understanding of modernity. And of course, Russian region, Russia is a very multinational, multi-ethnical country. And of course, during Soviet time, all this something what didn't fit into political understanding how everything should be, how the progress should be implemented regionally. Everything was just erased, suppressed, and we are of course trying to repair this. These processes now, and we're also learning from our colleagues that are dealing with maybe similar processes, and we try to also apply knowledge and theories that are developed elsewhere through the lens of feminism and decolonizing theory. We try to also explain this these implications also to ourselves. So through that, we're learning also about ourselves and reflect on our practice. So it's a kind of also it's a process, really.
Yeah.
Terike,
your sound is off.
Your sound is off.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your comments. I feel that one of the problems that I feel like we enter partly because of the formats, which don't represent the formats of dialogue that we are building, which, I mean, now everything's on Zoom, so it's even more detached, and it doesn't really represent any of our actual lives, like lived community lives. But I think one of the questions that always at least I come up with is the question of community and the question of lived community and how our thinking is related to lived community. And when I think of, I was just talking with someone, actually Paulina Fedorov, who's also going to be one of the artists in the Venice Pavilion. And we were talking about the way in which, like both in the Soviet imaginary, but also in the capitalist like society, both are based on cutting off social relations, cutting off the community. Like in the Soviet scenario, you don't need the community because you're a citizen and you just need the state, and everything's free, everything's open. Even intimacy or intimate relationships are not bound to like this sort of core relationships. Then in capitalism, you sort of have the nuclear family, which consists of two individuals who are like, even in the nuclear family, they're just somehow on their own. And so this cutting off of social relationships, which of course we now see during the time of the pandemic, in like really amplified in a really painful way, I think is the sort of symptom and but also cause of a lot of the trouble that we're in. And so my question kind of always comes up, like, how do we rebuild community? How do we rebuild community in a way that is embodied and allows for meaningful relationships of care? And I agree with Julian that care can be possessive and care can be violent or oppressive. And oftentimes is, but the matter of fact is that we do need care. We do need to be cared for, but even more than that, we do need to care for others. That's an even more core need that we have. And so, how to build lived communities that somehow, and to me, this is like, it's just, I feel that I'm personally like I'm in a state of being completely cornered. As a white person growing out of a white culture that doesn't give me any tradition to lean back on, any tradition in relationship to land, in relationship to intergenerational knowledge, to start rebuilding that. Because all the models of like polyamory or like living in a squat somewhere, like they're all very easily like very transactionary when they're kind of coming out of a sort of like or embedded in this neoliberal individualism that we're part of. So yeah, for me the core question, and then so that's in a way like questions like how do we build community? We don't have to look elsewhere. We can look elsewhere and see what other cultures are doing, but we still have to do the work. Like we here have to do the work. without resorting to some other culture. We can have kinship, and we can have solidarity, and we can have like meaningful relationships and learn from each other, but we still have to do the work. And I would just really love to get to talking a little bit about like, how can we do the work? How can we how can we build a community? Or I'd at least like to hear if this resonates, or whether you have some thoughts or some experiments on that actually will help, because this is getting really painful. It's painful to be in the world in this isolated way that is the white way of being.
But I was thinking also about this, and I think a similar experience, of course, is also like one of the way to do it. And I had these crazy ideas about like how people can actually, when we started this symposium, we were talking about like with the first panel about like global planetary conditions we exist on, and like how to find this language that would, visual language, academic language, how to like everyday language that would lead us to some kind of a cognitive understanding and cognitive understanding for different actions. And I'm following this. There is one pretty known and outspoken astronaut in the Netherlands. His name is Andreas Kuipers. And I don't know if you know him, but he works a lot with kids, and he is sharing with them his experience of looking at the Earth from space, just to give them understanding like how fragile Earth is. And then if I would have ability, we would and if we would go like all together in the space and like, I don't know, maybe take on board with us some leaders of some leading corporations that are extinguishing natural resources on an everyday basis. So we could experience this look at Earth from space to see how actually fragile is this. This is my experiment. Yeah, that's
it's interesting because I think when we talk about space, it's also mirrors so much what's happening in the Arctic, and how space is this resource. And I just curated a show about space, and also I'm looking into these contemporary processes that are happening to the space, and how space is getting privatized, and also kind of all these political forces in space have been joined by corporate interests, and how it will become this super elitist place as well, through corporations just creating a certain refugee zones for the rich, and using the space for its own benefit. So I don't know if I don't know, just had a thought about how this maybe will not help, Anya, this utopian attempt to put all the rich guys in the space, and it will change their mind completely about all the processes that they are very responsible for. So I don't know if it's
even back in 2003, Frederick Jameson said that he can imagine the end of the world, but it's very difficult to imagine end of capitalism, right? Speaking from a perspective of a white privileged people who kind of would consciously or subconsciously thinking, for them maybe it's easy to imagine the end of the world at the end of their privileges, right? But Terike, what about you? I mean, your artistic method is amazing in terms of digging into the fragility of our reality and bringing it into a different artistic format. What is your theory about community repairing or building?
I honestly, I don't know. And that's why a lot of my work is about that question, because I find it very painful and hard, and I don't have the answer. And the kind of of course, I do try to cultivate the relationships I have and try to think of thinking together. For example, of like how can we share authorship, for example. How can we, like, I think the figure of the artist is really like bound with this neoliberal figure of the individual, or the figure of the individual in Western thought, like more widely, but then especially now is the model case of like the neoliberal subject that's just like creative and just freelancing and it's not bound to anything and it's just a complete outsider. But also there is a emphasis on that to think of art practice as like making stuff, like coming up with products, we talk about production, we talk about art objects. Our whole language is like saturated with thinking of art through like capitalism. And as an artist, I've become more and more uncomfortable with that, and I feel that actually it misses like actually most of what art practice is about, and that actually art practice mostly is about a certain way of being that precedes the making of any work. It's a cultivation of a certain relationality towards the world where you are open and you are vulnerable and you somehow let things move you and touch you, and you have to somehow like cultivate a way of existing with the world that is porous and undefined and open in that way. And I think that's actually that's the work in a way. And I don't think that's artist specific, but it's like that's a potential that we all have. And so one thing that I've been really trying to think of is like, how can we conceptualize art making in a way that would not be bound to thinking of art making as making of these cultural objects, whether they're gestures, and this is a different thing than from like relational aesthetics. I don't mean that, because that's still bound on like art is about form and art is about like, but just like just cultivating ways of existing together and breathing and being together and being in a relationship, and how that changes our way of understanding, like, do we need exhibition spaces, or how do we remake that from the point of view of where we are? And my only answer at this point is, of course, it's like painful now because of the pandemic, which has like amplified all this. It's kind of amplified this culture of isolation that's already existed before, and now it just like cemented that's the condition. But what I've been trying to do is just to cultivate relationships to people I care about and love, and try to think together with them, and try to think of how they actually inform my own thinking and practice, and like start to dismantle this idea that we're somehow like isolated in some way. But materially it's really hard, because like we have to fight. Even just thinking of like ethical non-monogamy, it's difficult, because we have to fight the marriage institution, we have to fight like mortgage institutions, we have to fight like, every step of the way, housing, education, how we raise our kids, like how to actually like open up in any other formation of community in a material sense. You almost need to buy a plot of land and move there with some people, because it's really difficult to do. It's possible, maybe, I don't know if it's possible.
Yeah, we were talking about the vocabulary and actually like different language or different artistic method, and I think I very much liked what Susan Shupley said about her practice. So she said like that she sees herself more as a kind of public narrator, and kind of her practice more bound to journalism and anthropology and mediating processes, and rather than like artistic fitting into this public understanding of artistic practice. So yeah, and but I very much liked also about this also kind of new thing, new dictionary. Basically, I made some notes. I'm just looking at this, how we looked at these new forms of sensibility, new rights, which Susan again talked about yesterday, and new society of change, which Medina was mentioning, or critical zone, which Egor brought up through Latour. And yeah, we and yesterday also I was thinking like, okay, why don't we have this environmental law person in our panel as well, when because you look, Terike, closely at the legislative documents, and it is actually very difficult to find any kind of crime which is happening in this kind of through the processes of invisible environmental changes, right? So the law itself is, you're talking about like animal rights, but there is also like ecological law that it's kind of also undeveloped, really, and it's so much behind those processes that are happening in the society nowadays. It's not reflecting those rights and justice, and as you said, like animal rights versus social justice, right? So it's a kind of like it's still very binary. It's so detached from each other, and in the law books as well.
Yeah, but law is also being remade, you know, just to serve the elite. And I think we see and witness many processes of that, and also happening in Russia when environmental regulations are being pushed just to legitimize certain actions that are harmful for people and territories. And we've had this, you know, in the case of Shias, people managed to prevent building this huge waste plant, but also we had this catastrophe close to Norilska, where there was a huge oil spill that has affected the entire ecosystem of you know, nearby. So and no, our actions can't undo it, you know, and these are all the consequences that we have to deal with, that our ecosystem is being damaged by those in power, and our energy, I think, is a very minimal. These powers are not equal at all. So this kind of small step that we were talking about are important, but they're also very minor when it comes to bringing change, and that makes me very sad. And I think people who are living in the territories that are being damaged continuously, and that they're experiencing the systematic deterioration, we see them from very far, you know, and we kind of forget about all these environmental catastrophes that take place, but they are affecting all of us in the end, and this is very hard to prevent, because there are more and more of processes like this happening, and also the politicians are not stopping them. And I'm thinking about, you know, the Amazon forest fires, and the Brazilian situation, the Brazilian political situation, also kind of contributing to environmental situations. So I'm not that hopeful. I mean, I was very inspired by Marina's thesis about communities of change in the beginning, but like over this few days, I think my optimism started to decrease.
I kind of think as like some kind of shift to eco-socialism as a transitional phase to then something else that's much more based on local small communities. But I would actually be interested in Julian's view on this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a prescription for the future. It's too difficult to prescribe as such, but I just wanted to echo your own thoughts about the importance of thinking about care as a practice of community. I guess you know that community, it's a really thorny concept within political theory and philosophy, and it's one of those concepts which I've always stayed away from because it's very difficult. But of course, there's the work of Jean-Luc Nancy and others, which is very, very rich on that. And then, of course, there's the whole set of projects and practices, as well as literatures on the commons, which is, I think, has been a very important development within my own field of political theory and philosophy over the last 10 years, also shaped by practices and experiments in new ways of being in common. And there's some good work out there. Lauren Berlant is very interesting, Michael Hart and Negri, and so on and so forth. But I wanted to also ratify, so to speak, the point you were making about the importance of care. And one of the things I got out of this book by Lisa Stevenson on the failure of care in the Canadian Arctic was, and this is also an element of her methodology as an anthropologist, is and it's, you know, it's perhaps widely shared, but the importance of listening, the ability to listen. And I think when it comes to our approaches to indigeneity and indigenous peoples, even though there is this essentially new racism, but also this kind of move to try to include the indigenous and build community across those historically vexed boundaries and colonial boundaries, there's what comes out of the book by Stevenson is that there's still this incredible failure to listen and to hear hear about the experience of care. Because without listening, you cannot understand how to care, actually, because care is an incredibly complex, difficult practice. It's one thing to want to care and to try to care, but it's very easy to fail at care as well without this capacity for listening. Sounds very basic, but it's actually something which I think is generally done very badly.
I think just to add to that, Paulina Fedorov also I think made a really good distinction between independency and autonomy. And so I think the task is how to build a culture of interdependency while still valuing or acknowledging modes of autonomy. And I think consent is actually a concept that's really useful, which also comes then down to intimate and personal relationships. And there's a lot to learn from that. Yeah.
If anyone has any other questions, comments, because I think we are a little bit already over the time, and you probably plan some other things for today. So I would like to, we would like to thank you so much for the panel today and for the very fruitful conversation after that. And I also would like to use a chance to thank all our panelists for during these 3 days. And even though they're not maybe listening now, but we're going to put the video online, and then I hope that they will hear that. And we want to put also some sort of composed booklet, e-booklet, that all our concerns would be somehow in, and discussions and thoughts would be somehow in one place, and that could enlighten other people who also cares. And yeah. So Masha, would you like to say anything, or Christina, or Katya, I don't know, Taro, maybe you also would like to say anything?
Yeah, for me it has been a very productive weekend. I think we all learned, I learned a lot from others, and I think also something about myself. And it's been a very inspiring, despite all my pessimism, event, and also very brain stimulating, something that I've been lacking a lot during the pandemic, and was many projects interrupted and paused. So thank you all for joining, and it's just so good to see others people's faces, because it's just been a journey within a very small community for me recently. So it's good to see new people and new faces. And I want to thank the organizers of the forum, of course, first of all, and I'm super happy about the collaboration with the Arctic Art Institute and Ekaterina Sharova and Kristina Dragina, and I hope that the forum will continue, and I want to repeat again and stress again that the work that they're doing is very crucial, and I really hope that the next year forum will take place in Arkhangelsk, as all these 3 previous years, and that we will go back to offline format at some point. And I also want to thank our technical team for making all of this streaming and our connection possible. In the beginning, we've had some difficulties that we successfully have overcome. So I would like to also thank Maria Skomarokhova and Tagir and our interpreters who have been doing very hard work this weekend, because we were talking about pretty serious things, and they were very rapid and fast and very intellectual about translating this both ways. So thanks a lot to Evgenia Tanasichuk and Alexei Telegin. Thank you guys for this support with the language. Language is a very crucial thing, as we've also discussed today and during the previous days. So if anyone has any short closing remarks or anything, please go ahead.
Raise your hand.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So, okay, so this symposium is closed. Thank you all again, and let's be in touch and think of building this
Thank you for participation.
was talking about. Was looking into new ways and thinking more about how eco-socialism could be a way to a better future.
Yeah. We
I'm
can't
bored.
afford being pessimistic, so let's guys continue doing, and with even more courage and energy, and yeah. Thank you very much, and
Thank you.
Sending you a virtual kiss and hugs, and hope to see you soon.
Yeah, in real life someday. Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.